The Anglo-Saxon settlement of Britain was the process, from the mid-5th to early 7th centuries, by which the language and culture of most of England were transformed from Romano-British to Germanic. Following the Roman withdrawal in the early 5th century, the traditional view of the process has assumed an invasion of several Germanic peoples, later collectively referred to as Anglo-Saxons, for the western coasts of continental Europe, followed by the establishment of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms across most of England and parts of lowland Scotland. The assumption that the Anglo-Saxon settlement developed from the invasion and mass migration of people from the Germanic coastlands, largely displacing the native people, has been challenged by those suggesting that the changes in material culture and language were caused primarily by a process of acculturation that followed the movement of a relatively small number of people. Some writers have also argued that the influence of Germanic peoples and culture was already present in eastern regions of pre-Roman Britain. Modern scholarship encompasses a wide range of possibilities, from Anglo-Saxon culture arising from overwhelmingly insular changes influenced by cultural contacts across the North Sea, perhaps including the influx of small numbers of warrior elites via a range of larger-scale immigration scenarios, through to variations on the mass migration and displacement hypothesis. The extent to which income has displaced or supplanted the existing inhabitants and the extent to which mutual acculturation occurred is the subject of ongoing debate. At the center of this debate is the creation of an acceptable model for cultural and linguistic change, as there are few historical or contemporary sources relating to the Anglicization of lowland Britain. The sources that do exist are open to a variety of interpretations, as is the more recently available evidence largely derived from archaeology and genetic research. A conflict between archaeology-based evidence and a traditional interpretation of historical sources, especially Bede, has arisen. In particular, archaeological evidence for the formation of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and kingship is lacking before the eve of the Christian conversion, with an essentially tribal society indicated in earlier periods. This is in direct conflict with the many early kings and their exploits, described by Bede. Background: by AD 400, the Roman provinces in Britain were a peripheral part of the Roman Empire in the west, occasionally lost to rebellion or invasion, but until then always eventually recovered. That cycle of loss and recapture collapsed over the next decade, eventually around 410, although Roman power remained a force to be reckoned with for a further 3 generations across much of Gaul. Britain slipped beyond direct imperial control into a phase which has generally been termed sub-Roman. The history of this period has traditionally been a narrative of decline and fall. However, evidence from Verulamium suggests that urban-type rebuilding, featuring piped water, was continuing late on in the 5th century, if not beyond. At Silchester, there are signs of sub-Roman occupation down to around AD 500, and at Wroxeter new Roman baths have been identified as Roman type. The writing of Patrician Gildas demonstrates the survival in Britain of Latin literacy and Roman education, learning and law within elite society and Christianity throughout the bulk of the 5th and 6th centuries. There are also signs in Gildas' works that the economy was thriving without Roman taxation, as he complains of luxuria and self-indulgence. This is the 5th century Britain into which the Anglo-Saxons appear. Historical evidence. Surveying the historical sources for signs of the Anglo-Saxon settlement and the people assumes that the words Angles, Saxons or Anglo-Saxon have the same meaning in all the sources. Assigning ethnic labels such as Anglo-Saxon is fraught with difficulties, and the term itself only began to be used in the 8th century to distinguish Germanic groups in Britain from those on the continent. Early sources: the Chronica Gallica of 452 records for the year 441. The British provinces, which to this time had suffered various defeats and misfortunes, are reduced to Saxon rule. The Chronicle was written some distance from Britain. There is uncertainty about precise dates for 5th century events, especially before 446. This, however, does not undermine the position of the Gallic chronicles as a very important contemporary source, which suggests that Bede's later date for the arrival of the Saxons was mistaken. In the Chronicle, Britain is grouped with 4 other Roman territories which came under Germanic dominion around the same time, the list being intended as an explanation of the end of the Roman Empire in the West. The 4 share a similar history, as they were all given into the power of the barbarians by Roman authority. 3 were deliberately settled with German federates, and though the Vandals took Africa by force, the dominion was confirmed by treaty. Procopius states that Britain was settled by 3 races, the Angeli, Frisians, and Britons, each ruled by its own king. Each race was so prolific that it sent large numbers of individuals every year to the Franks, who planted them in unpopulated regions of its territory. Writing in the mid-6th century, he also states that after the overthrow of Constantine III in 411, the Romans never succeeded in recovering Britain, but it remained from that time under tyrants. Gildas de Excidioe Conquest Britanniae. In Gildas' work of the 6th century, De Excidioe Conquest Britanniae, a religious tract on the state of Britain, the Saxons were enemies originally from overseas, who brought well-deserved judgment upon the local kings or tyrants. The sequence of events in Gildas is interesting. After an appeal to Aetius, the Britons were gripped by famine while suffering attacks from the Picts and Scotti. Some fought back successfully, leading to a period of peace. Peace led to luxuria and self-indulgence. A renewed attack was threatened by the Picts and Scotti, and this led to a council, where it was proposed and agreed that land in the east would be given to the Saxons on the basis of a treaty, a foedus, by which the Saxons would defend the Britons in exchange for food supplies. This type of arrangement was unexceptional in a late Roman context. Franks had been settled as foederati on imperial territory in northern Gaul in the 4th century, and the Visigoths were settled in Gallia Aquitania early in the 5th century. The Saxon foederati first complained that the monthly supplies were inadequate. Then they threatened to break the treaty, which they did, spreading the onslaught from sea to sea. This war, which Hayem called the War of the Saxon Federates, ended some 20 to 30 years later, shortly after the siege at Mons Badonicus, and some 40 years before Gildas was born. There was a peace with the Saxons, who returned to their eastern home, which Gildas called a lugubre divortium barbarorum, a grievous divorce from the barbarians. The divorce settlement, Hayem in particular has argued, was an improved treaty from the British viewpoint. This included the ability to extract tribute from the people in the east who were under the leadership of the person Gildas called Pater Diabolis. Gildas used the correct late Roman term for the Saxons, foederati, people who came to Britain under a well-used treaty system. This kind of treaty had been used elsewhere to bring people into the Roman Empire to move along the roads or rivers and work alongside the army. Gildas called them Saxons, which was probably the common British term for the settlers. Interestingly, Gildas' use of the word patria, when used in relation to the Saxons and Picts, gave the impression that some Saxons could by then be regarded as native to Britannia. Britain for Gildas was the whole island. Ethnicity and language were not the issue. It was the leader's faith and actions. The rest of the details are as Snyder had it: by products from his recounting of royal sins. There is a strong tradition of Christian writers who were concerned with the moral qualities of leadership, and Gildas joined these. He used apocalyptic language. For example, the Saxons were villains, enemies, led by a devil father. Yet Gildas had lived through, in his own words, an age of external peace, and it is this peace that brought with it the tyrannous, unjust rule. Gildas' remarks reflected his continuing concern regarding the vulnerability of his countrymen and the disregard in infighting. For example, it was always true of this people that it was weak in beating off the weapons of the enemy, but strong in putting up with civil war and the burden of sin. Quote, however, after the War of the Saxon Federates, if there were acts of genocide, mass exodus or mass slavery, Gildas did not seem to know about them. Gildas, in discussing the holy shrines, mentioned that the spiritual life of Britain had suffered, because the partition of the country, which was preventing the citizens from worshipping at the shrines of the martyrs. Control had been ceded to the Saxons, even control of access to such shrines. The church was now tributary, her sons had embraced dung, and the nobility had lost their authority to govern. Gildas described the corruption of the elite. Britain has kings but they are tyrants, she has judges but they are wicked. This passage provides a glimpse into the world of Gildas. He continued, they plunder and terrorize the innocent, they defend and protect the guilty and thieving, they have many wives, whores and adulteresses, swear false oaths, tell lies, reward thieves, sit with murderous men, despise the humble, the commanders are enemies of God. The list is long. Interestingly, oath-breaking and the absence of just judgments for ordinary people were mentioned a number of times. British leadership everywhere was amoral and the cause of the ruin of Britain. Bede's Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum. Gildas and other sources were used by Bede in his Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum, written around 731. Bede identifies the migrants as Angles, Saxons and Jutes, reporting that the Saxons came from Old Saxony and the Angles from Anglia, which lay between the homelands of the Saxons and Jutes. Anglia is reasonably taken to be the old Schleswig-Holstein province and containing the modern Angeln. Jutland was the homeland of the Jutes, and the coast between the Elbe and Weser rivers is the Saxon area of origin. Crucially, Bede seems to identify three phases of settlement: an exploration phase, when mercenaries came to protect the resident population; a migration phase, which was substantial, as implied by the statement that Anglia was deserted; and an establishment phase, in which Anglo-Saxons started to control areas, implied in Bede's statement about the origins of the tribes. This analysis of Bede has led to a re-evaluation, in terms of continuity and change, of Bede's Northumbrian view of history and how this view was projected back into the account of the latter two phases of settlement, and a possible overhaul of the traditional chronological framework. The concept of Bretwalda originates in Bede's comment on who held the Imperium of Britain. For this concept, historians have inferred a formal institution of overlordship south of the Humber. Whether such an institution existed is uncertain, but Simon Keynes argues that the idea is not an invented concept. The Bretwalda concept is taken as evidence for a presence of a number of early Anglo-Saxon elite families, whether the majority were early settlers, descendant from settlers, or especially after the exploration stage, were Roman-British leaders who adopted Anglo-Saxon culture is unclear, but the balance of opinion is that most were migrants. Notable gaps include: no one from the East or West Midlands is represented in the list of Bretwaldas, and there is some uncertainty about the dates of these leaders. Bede's view of Britons is partly responsible for the picture of them as the downtrodden subjects of Anglo-Saxon oppression. This has been used by linguists and archaeologists who have produced genocidal, slavery and bloody invasion settlement theories. Bede's derogatory depiction of the Britons is influenced by what he had read in Gildas, which had also sought to understand God's will. For Gildas, the Saxons represented God's scourge, and he saw the horrors of the Saxon as God's retribution for the sins of his people. Bede focused on this point and extended Gildas' vision by portraying the pagan Anglo-Saxons not as God's scourge against the reprobate Britons, but rather as the agents of Britain's redemption. Therefore, the ghastly scenario that Gildas feared is calmly explained away by Bede. Any rough treatment was necessary and ordained by God, because the Britons had lost God's favor and incurred his wrath. Bede is not using ethnicity in the same manner as a modern reader. Windy McKinney observes Bede's use of was much more mutable, tied to the expression of tradition and religious ideas, to the loyalty of a people to authority, and subject to change as history continued to unfold. Therefore, it is a moot point whether all of those whom Bede encompassed under the term Angli were racially Germanic. Indeed, Bede himself may not have been an ethnically pure Anglo. Tribal Hidage. The Tribal Hidage is a list of 35 tribes that was compiled in Anglo-Saxon England sometime between the 7th and 9th centuries. The inclusion of the Elmet dwellers suggests to Simon Keynes that the Tribal Hidage was compiled in the early 670s, during the reign of King Wulfhere, since Elmet seems to have reverted thereafter to Northumbrian control. It includes a number of independent kingdoms and other smaller territories and assigns a number of hides to each one. A hide was an amount of land sufficient to support a household. The list of tribes is headed by Mercia and consists almost exclusively of peoples who lived south of the Humber estuary and territories that surrounded the Mercian kingdom, some of which have never been satisfactorily identified by scholars. The document is problematic, but extremely important for historians as it provides a glimpse into the relationship between people, land and the tribes and groups into which they had organized themselves. The individual units in the list developed from the settlement areas of tribal groups, some of which are as little as 300 hides. The names are difficult to locate at places like East Wixner and Swardora. What it reveals is that micro-identity of tribe and family is important from the start. The list is evidence for more complex settlement than the single political entity of the other historical sources. Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is an historical record of events in Anglo-Saxon England which was kept from the late 9th to the mid-12th century. The Chronicle is a collection of annals that were still being updated, in some cases more than 600 years after the events they describe. They contain various entries that seem to add to the breadth of the historical evidence and provide good evidence for a migration, the Anglo-Saxon elite and various significant historical events. The earliest events described in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle were transcribed centuries after they had occurred. Barbara York, Patrick Sims Williams and David Dumville, among others, have highlighted how a number of features of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle for the 5th and early 6th centuries clearly contradict the idea that they contain a reliable year-by-year record. Stuart Laycock has suggested that there may be information from the early period that can be used on the basis that the obvious glosses and fictions should be rejected. The kernel behind some entries might contain a truth, and whilst the dates are uncertain, Laycock believes some of the 6th century events may describe real situations. However, presenting evidence for the Anglo-Saxon settlement from a chronicle such as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is uncertain and relies heavily on the present view of which entries are acceptable truth. As Damville points out about the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, medieval historiography has assumptions different from our own, particularly in terms of distinctions between fiction and non-fiction.